This week, 20 years after the World Trade Center terror attacks on September 11, 2001, we learned of 2 more victims who were identified, bringing the total now up to 1,647. It's a testament to the painstaking work that's never stopped of analyzing DNA samples, sometimes from tiny remains. New York City's chief medical examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, said, 20 years ago, we made a promise to the families of World Trade Center victims to do whatever it takes for as long as it takes to identify their loved ones. With these 2 new identifications, we continue to fulfill that sacred obligation. Nearly 3,000 people died that dark day in New York, and to date, about 40% of the victims remain unidentified. Joining us to discuss this vital behind-the-scenes work is Mechthild Prinz, who was in the thick of it as the Assistant Director of Forensic Biology for New York's Chief Medical Examiner at the time of the attacks. Mechthild, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm happy to be here.
So the monumental work that your team started back in 2001 continues until today. I have many questions about that process, but I wonder if you could start off by just taking us back 20 years ago. What do you remember about that day and the days that followed?
Yeah, as for many of us, the day started quite normal. It was a beautiful September day, and I was in a management meeting with my boss, Robert Shaler, and the other assistant directors of the Department of Forensic Biology, when one of our colleagues came into the office saying a plane flew into the World Trade Center, and he and several others of the office, including the chief medical examiner, Dr. Hirsch, went down to the site. But we just stayed in the room because we knew it would be the office's duty to identify any victims of this horrible terrorist attack. So we basically started planning on what to do.
Did you have any sense at all of the scale you'd be dealing with?
No. I think nobody knew. I do remember hospitals were preparing for lots of injuries, and thankfully, most of the people in the buildings managed to escape, and virtually all of the deceased were unfortunately trapped above the crash site. So we did not know what was coming, no.
And when did the onslaught start for you? When did the real work begin?
Same day. The morgue was open to receive remains, and there was a triage team, fingerprint experts, X-ray experts, forensic dentists, forensic anthropologists, of course the medical examiners, and then a DNA person was down in the morgue to advise on which samples to take for DNA testing from each body part. Because it was, unfortunately, it was body parts. It was not intact bodies like you would normally expect in your daily operations.
So how long did this intense level of work last for you and your team?
The excavation of the site, I think, lasted until May 2002, and our testing lasted until 2005, when we officially decided we've done a lot. We tested every body part at least once, and we would stop the effort until advanced technologies would come along that promised higher success rates. So it was stopped in 2005, but then briefly afterwards it was restarted because additional remains were found on surrounding rooftops, and then a systematic review of every piece, as you already mentioned, is still continuing today.
Remarkable. So what changed? I know that DNA was used a lot more than it had been previously. Can you just explain that a bit for us?
DNA was always considered to be too expensive and take too long, but with such a degree of fragmentation that we saw at the World Trade Center there, unfortunately, was a limitation to how much we could achieve with dental and fingerprints. So DNA technology got a seat at the table, and that continues to this day.
So what's the family involvement in this process? If somebody is listing someone as missing, you need their DNA sample to identify the victim? Is that how it works?
Yes. So normally what is collected is both a DNA sample from a biological relative, and the closer the better. So children and parents give a better degree of DNA matching than a sister or an aunt. But the other sample we can collect is, we call them personal references. For example, your toothbrush or your hairbrush would contain your own DNA. Medical samples work well too. And some of the firefighters had been registered in a bone marrow transplant donor database. Those samples they had to submit there for genetic testing worked to identify them, or other medical samples that get collected, like those PKU cards from newborns. Anything where we can be sure that it is your own DNA.
And I remember we were speaking earlier and you were telling me about the unique case of the firefighters. You were working directly on that. Could you describe that a little bit?
Yes, so it's normally with a body part, we would have no indication which identity is behind, or there's no candidate identity. So those samples, we would generate a DNA profile. The DNA profile would be in a database, and then the database would get searched against the database of family references. But with firefighters, they were wearing their bunker suits. Those bunker suits are virtually indestructible, and they do have their name and their number in the suit. So very often, firefighters who had been at the site helping with excavation found bunker suits, and then they knew who it possibly could be, and they were really eager to tell the family because they knew those families very often. But we couldn't be sure that the remains in the bunker suit are really from that specific firefighter, because off-duty firefighters had responded and went to station houses and just grabbed bunker suits to go to the site. So we had it was like a rush team. We tested specifically remains where we had a candidate ID and compared with those family members without going through the database process.
Be sure to watch the entire episode, now available exclusively at epochtv.com, a new completely censorship-free premium subscription platform. Brought to you by the Epoch Times. See you there.